Good afternoon, morning, evening, colleagues. Today I want to talk about Chapter 12 in the Congress Reconsidered book, particularly looking at how congressional procedures affect policy change. The overview of the chapter, it's looking at policy change, and particularly how the energy legislation from the OPEC embargo to Obama sidestep of Congress in 2009 occurred, examining a few main points. One is the idea of congressional procedures and rule changes that occurred in the 70s did not actually enhance Congress's ability to pass legislation or any meaningful change to major areas of policy. In fact, it has proved more or less to be a hindrance to any major policy change. Really, the defining characteristic of these time periods was Congress did not feel any sort of need to act on legislation unless there was some sort of crisis and public demand forcing policy change. Ultimately, what came down to it is congressional process, even in times of public crisis, really limited their ability to affect any sort of drastic or meaningful policy change. And what this has created is an environment whereby presidents are more likely to use a broad interpretation of their statutory powers to affect any sort of major or meaningful policy change. Now, the struggle for energy independence is kind of what defines all these periods that Oppenheimer looks like. Going back to, again, really they only feel the pressure to change energy policy during times of crisis. Well, the first time of crisis that they really feel the need is during the OPEC embargo of 1973 to 1974. Congressmen, presidents from both parties were advocating the need for greater energy independence. That still occurs today. The problem was finding some sort of specific policy as to how to approach that. There was a general consensus that there needed to be something done, but nobody could ever agree on what to do. Congress did not necessarily always divide along party lines, but into several different factions. The main groupings came down to those that were supply side free market approach congressmen who really saw the need for Congress to do very little as far as intervention into the energy market, but allow for the market to make corrections and to provide the solutions to energy issues, versus more consumer-oriented approach whereby these groups of congressmen wanted to limit the impact of energy prices while finding ways to conserve and reduce demand on the energy market. Another interesting grouping that occurs during these timeframes is you have congressmen and senators from energy-producing states wanting certain policy goals, and congressmen and senators from energy-consuming states where they're very dependent and sensitive to price changes in the energy market. Sometimes they would be opposed to one another on certain policy positions. Other times, interestingly enough, they would band together. And then this occurs early on in the very early stages of the energy debate. You would see very liberal and very conservative members banding together against more moderate members of Congress. Not necessarily because the liberals and conservatives were agreeing on the policy position. It was more or less for the liberals, the policy didn't go far enough, and for the very conservative, the policy didn't went too far. So they would band together and vote against the more moderate members of Congress. So policy questions facing energy legislation. First, in order to effectively address it, they had to know how to proceed with reform. So questions on what is the best way to make the U.S. less dependent on foreign oil. For some, that might be opening up for more drilling in the United States, subsidizing the energy industry. Others, it would mean finding ways to reduce consumption, finding ways to promote renewable energy sources. Should government mitigate the impacts of rising energy costs? How does that take form? Who gets tax incentives and subsidies? Should lower income families receive tax subsidies for paying energy costs? Should oil companies receive tax breaks for new oil exploration? Should subsidies be given to energy companies seeking to find ways to find alternative energy sources? Also, how far should government intervention in the energy market go? Should it be unregulated? Should there be price controls? Windfall tax come into these sorts of equations. From there, how much focus should be on the environmental impacts of energy policy? One way to simple way to decrease energy prices is increase supply. But that doesn't necessarily do anything in regards to decreasing the dependence on oil. People begin to consume it, and it has environmental impacts. Now, looking at the periods of energy policy change, Oppenheimer identifies 5 periods where Congress attempted to enact new energy policy. The first was the era of what he calls new obstructionism, which occurs during the 70s from the OPEC embargo to the end of the Carter administration. Then there's the era of relative inaction, or what I call the era of the status quo, that occurs from 1981 to 2000. From there, you have the era of partisanship in energy legislation during the first term of the Bush administration. Then the era of Democratic control in a different direction that comes into play when the Democrats retake Congress in 2007. And then the era of the Obama administration and CAFE standards in 2009, where you see more executive action into the energy sector. Looking at the era of new obstructionism, Congress had just passed procedural reforms to decentralize power in Congress, but what it did was it hindered their ability to mobilize majorities to enact policy change. This was heightened in the House particularly because what you saw was a shifting away of the powers of committee chairs towards more individual members of Congress. With energy policy, one of the big hindrances to new energy policy was the multiple jurisdictions that multiple committees had over energy policy. So these committees would draft very different types of energy bills, and it became a problem trying to reconcile all these bills into one clean energy bill. Also, the committee chairs became weakened and they couldn't deliver on their ability to deliver their members and deliver bills out of committee. As subcommittees gained new powers and individuals became more important, they wanted to protect their jurisdictions and were more able to throw up roadblocks and obstruct new legislation. And the reforms increased the individual members of Congress who were reluctant to cede their new powers to party leaders. The amendment process proved particularly troublesome, as individual members would pose amendments to energy bills that would end up defeating compromises that had occurred. And then really, it's defined by the subcommittee obstructionism process, which really creates delays in the policy process. Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, when he comes to power, he finds a way to overcome the problems of the 94th Congress, and he enacts ways to reduce obstructionism in the 95th Congress. He utilizes his increased powers of the Speaker and party leaders that previous speakers did not use. First was establishing an ad hoc committee on energy. They would handle energy policy. He was very selective in his membership by bringing together important members of the various committees, trying to build a coalition across the party that would generate support once the bill got to the floor. He also oversaw very closely the Rules Committee process on energy legislation by making sure that they created closed rules that would prevent these amendments from being tacked on to energy bills that would unravel any compromises that had been made in the ad hoc committee. And then ultimately, he crafts an energy bill that would try to find the median, certainly of the House and also to a certain extent the Senate. So it creates an interesting problem or an interesting voting line in the House and in the Senate, where you see more moderate members of Congress voting in a block and the more liberal and conservative members voting in a block against the legislation. Then you have the era of inaction from 1981 to 2001. You have a return to divided government with Reagan in control of the White House. The Republicans control the Senate for a period of times, but also energy prices decrease. More people believe in free market solutions for energy issues. So the desire to enact any sort of policy change remains low. Most energy legislation during this time fails to make it make it to the floor of the House or the Senate. And really increasing partisan polarization and political homogeneity within the parties kind of defines the shift. And you see it easier for party leaders to mobilize their member, but absent any sort of crisis, there was no real demand to do anything with energy policy. Really, the only time that it had been seen was during the first Gulf War. There was a push, but by the time that ended and oil prices stabilized, the desire to promote new energy legislation went away. Then the era of partisanship in energy legislation occurs from 2001 to 2005. What you have is the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cause energy prices to rise, which precipitates new calls for energy legislation. Now, with the stronger parties in Congress and more partisan loyalty, congressional leaders more or less focused on crafting legislation that appealed to the median position of their party members versus the median position of all Congress. What happens is congressmen from energy producing states as well are leaning more towards heavily Republican states, and congressmen from energy consuming states are more in Democrat controlled states. So what you're saying is what wasn't occurring in the 70s. In the 70s, you had more of a distribution of congressmen that were both Republican Democrats from energy consuming states and vice versa for the energy producing states. Now you're starting to see energy producing states being more largely Republican and energy consuming states being more heavily Democrat. So that plays into the inability to get any sort of legislative traction on energy policy. And also a big feature of this time period is the Senate and its rule on cloture proved to be the largest obstacle to enacting energy legislation. Essentially, Oppenheimer says the median position on energy legislation became the position of the 60th senator in Congress in determining what the policy would look like, and they could never really overcome cloture. And we'll get into some more difficulties on this with the conclusions, but a lot of it has to do with, as they move more towards the median in both houses, they begin to lose the support of the party. Now, the era of Democratic control, conditional government, divided government, whatever you want to call it, Democrats sweep back into control of Congress, and they were actually able to pass significant energy legislation despite President Bush being in the White House. And a lot of this was contextual. Oil prices were beginning to surge, so members didn't disagree over whether there needed to be a change in energy policy. They typically all agreed there needed to be some sort of addressing of energy policy. The arguments came down to contents of the bill. The focus of energy legislation would be two-pronged. One was reducing the demand for fossil fuels. The second was developing renewable energy sources. Now, how this would take form was increasing CAFE standards, requiring a certain amount of renewable energy sources in the production of electricity, as well as incentivizing and subsidizing the development of renewable energy sources. Now, Democrat leaders wanted to avoid the problems that occurred for the Republicans from 2001 to 2005. They recognized that bicameralism would prove to be problematic. As parties are more polarized, the median position is going to be more to the liberal side in the House than it would be in the Senate. So what they did was each House crafted their own bill that met the median. They sent it to conference, and they really made it a choice for congressmen. Do you want to vote for an energy bill or not? And they were able to get it through Congress on a conference bill. Now, the era of administration of the Obama administration and executive action. So in 2009, President Obama essentially just takes unilateral action on energy policy by taking a broad interpretation of the energy bill of 2007. He announced new aggressive CAFE standards that Congress and interest groups had battled over in 2007. In fact, he brings the UAW and car manufacturers together who have been on opposite sides of the spectrum and improving it. And some of that comes down to the desire for stability in the process. Congress can be a very complex, long, unstable process, whereas an executive represented more stability, which both parties found more appealing. Congress played no role in the policy process, and there's little public outrage on the issue because of some of these contextual reasons. An interesting one enough is, at this time, the auto industry had just been bailed out by the federal government, so the president certainly held some carrot and stick to get them to comply with his desires. Now, the conclusions that Oppenheimer comes to. First, process has significantly affected the ability of Congress to enact significant policy change in recent decades. The decentralization of power, the more democratization of Congress, has not resulted in more legislation, but more veto points in the process of creating legislation. You look at public demand and crises are more likely to cause any sort of policy change. Absent a crisis, Congress doesn't necessarily feel the demand to engage in long-term policy solutions. And then policy changes will require legislation to find the median position of both houses. The problem with that is it's going to undermine party cohesion, which will limit the ability of Congress to actually pass legislation. The new committee era and the increasing control of party leaders has not proved to be a good solution in enacting new policy change. And then as the policy process in Congress becomes more obstructionist, it's more likely that presidents will begin to interpret their statutory powers more broadly to enact the policy change they see fit.